Hey everyone, Happy New Year, and we want to say Happy New Year and welcome to the very first Radiotopia Presents of 2024. It's a series that we are truly excited about. It's called Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. Now, this is from documentarian Jess Shane, who put out an open call on Craigslist and then worked with 4 strangers to explore the standard rules that documentarians and journalists use to tell their subject stories. So this series gets into all sorts of questions about what happens when people's real lives are collected, edited, and consumed. The show pulls back the curtain on what goes on behind the scenes of your favorite nonfiction shows. And then it turns in on itself and some really interesting twists and turns along the way in the making of the show. I've gotten to know Jess a little bit over the making of this show. Every time I chat with her, there's a new wrinkle to this story. It is really incredible. So go check out the new Radiotopia Presents series, Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. It is out now on your favorite podcast platform. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, March 9th, 1993. The event actually took place on March 10th, 1993, at a women's clinic in Pensacola, Florida. Dr. David Gunn was shot and killed by an anti-abortion protester, a man named Michael Griffin. This was a moment when the anti-abortion movement was growing increasingly violent and in your face. The killing of Dr. Gunn would become a touchstone moment for both sides of the abortion debate, and I think really mark a new era in many ways in the abortion debate. So let's discuss this incident, what changed after it, the aggressive, violent tactics of the movement. Here, as always, is Nicole Hemmer of Columbia. Hello, Niki.
Hello, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello, Kellie.
Hey there.
So, Niki, you want to paint a scene of that day in Pensacola? Who was Gunn, who was Griffin, and what happens on March 10th?
So Gunn was this abortion doctor, an abortion provider who traveled around the rural South, particularly in Alabama and Florida, to provide abortion services to women who otherwise didn't have access to them. And he was just a pretty ordinary guy. He was a doctor who walked around in blue jeans and sneakers, who had 2 kids. He actually had a pretty severe limp because he had polio as a child. And he was also, interestingly, he was a member of the Church of Christ, which was a religion that forbids abortion. So he wasn't actually out to his family as an abortion provider. And the moment that they find out that this is what he does is when they learn about his murder on the news. So Dr. Gunn, he comes to the Pensacola Women's Medical Services Clinic in order to provide abortions that day. And Michael Griffin, who was an anti-abortion activist and part of what we'll talk about, this much more militant, much more violent anti-abortion movement that emerges in the 1980s and 1990s. He calls out across the parking lot, "Don't kill any more babies." And then he shoots Dr. Gunn 3 times in the back, ultimately killing him. He will go on to blame this murder on being radicalized or brainwashed by another anti-abortion activist, although he is ultimately found guilty and put in prison for a very, very long time.
Kellie, what is your sense of that context of the way the movement was changing in this time? We should also say that, this isn't a totally random killing. I mean, there had been protests at this particular clinic. Dr. Gunn had been the target of intimidation, and now, and then this is a moment where it tipped over into deadly violence.
Yeah, the movement really takes on a violent, graphic undertone in which their main goal is to compel people to outrage. And so they show these really, awful, graphic, bloody pictures of discarded fetuses or blood tissue. They're trying to get people to see abortion as murder and nothing else but murder. And they really want people to see that the killing of these doctors is justified, is something that can be rationalized as almost a greater good because it's saving lives by saving babies and preventing them from death through abortion. This really is a moment that the anti-abortion movement becomes not just radicalized, but violent, militant, and unrelenting.
Yeah. And terroristic. right? The targeting of these doctors and these service providers, these clinics, really steps up over the 1980s and 1990s. They see themselves, particularly Operation Rescue, which is an organization founded in the 1980s, as sort of in the model of the civil rights movement. So at first they're doing these sit-ins, they're trying to call attention to the issue, but then, that slogan you mentioned, Kellie, abortion is murder, that becomes something that they imbue with real meaning. They say if you really believe this, that abortion is murder, and you should, then you should do anything to stop those murders from happening. This is an act of self-defense or defense of the defenseless. And that becomes this justification for bombings and arsons and break-ins and increasingly escalating to a series of murders across the 1990s and 2000s.
Yeah, there are a total of 4 doctors murdered by killers proclaiming pro-life motivation from the early 90s to the mid-2000s, and other violence and intimidation. And as you were both saying, an attempt to justify this, there's statements put out by 30 anti-abortion leaders that proclaim that Dr. Gunn was justified. And there's a moment on the Phil Donahue show in 1994 where an American minister is on and sort of justifying these murders. It's sort of hard to overstate how sort of central that just basic tenet was, and how much the drumbeat and the dark drumbeat of that was rising over this time. We've been talking about violence and intimidation for doctors to get them to stop performing. And you look at the stats, and I mean, in some ways it worked. There are far fewer actual doctors who perform abortions than there were, over the course of this era. But there was also violence and intimidation towards women who were seeking abortions too. And
that's really important, those images of really vulnerable women being shouted at, being pushed around, because this was an organization that was trying to tap into the moral power of civil rights sit-ins. But of course, who were the sources of violence and intimidation? It was the sit-in protesters. And their target wasn't, police officers with batons and German shepherds. It was these vulnerable women who were going in order to have a medical procedure. And so the visual of it it doesn't work the way they think that it's going to.
But even some of these women are not necessarily going in to get abortions.
Exactly.
They may be going in to seek help. If you're going into Planned Parenthood, there's a lot of different reasons that you might enter that building. And so regardless of what your reason was for going in, you could be harassed, targeted, screamed at. And it's frightening, incredibly frightening to know that, you're sort of by yourself alone trying to have a private moment with your medical provider, and that's interrupted by a gang of violent protesters.
Right.
And this actually leads to legislation in order to protect women who go to clinics. In 1994, Congress passes the Freedom of Access to Clinic Entrances Act, which is a very straightforwardly named act that created a space for women to enter these clinics without harassment. Although, of course, the Supreme Court has said you have a right to protest clinics, but there also has to be a right for women to freely access them as well.
We often think of abortion through the lens of Roe v. Wade, and we talk about the Supreme Court possibly revisiting it and the sort of, the legal battles that was going on. But this feels like a much more kind of bit by bit, on the ground, tactical battle to sort of say, regardless of what the legal structure is, if we just get to a place where actual abortions are not taking place, right? There's a level of intimidation, then that's one front of the battle as well.
Yeah, and I do think that's why a lot of this becomes very religious or gets co-opted by religious groups, because in some ways it's given the credence or the idea that religion trumps even the government in terms of what's happening, that it might be legal, but it's not right or it's not moral. And so those ideas, I think, feed people's behavior because they believe that they're justified, whether or not their acts are legal or not. The church is sanctioning all of that. And so it gives people a sense of legitimacy.
And of course, as you're saying, Jody, it works. There are fewer abortion doctors. There are fewer abortion providers. It scares some people away. We've seen it in nonviolent ways too, right? The promotion of hotlines that say that they're for pregnancy crisis moments that actually divert women away from abortion services. And then all of the new laws that are focused on shutting abortion clinics down rather than outlawing abortion itself. And so the picture that you begin to paint is one where violence is one of the tools in the toolkit that is combined with state level legislation, that is combined with pressure campaigns, that is combined with this kind of discussion of religion and morality and murder that Kellie is talking about. And that all comes together to, even with Roe v. Wade still in place, the access to abortion being greatly restricted in the nearly 50 years since it was ruled on.
I will say also that the kinds of restrictions that are placed on abortions are becoming more and more stringent. So now a lot of clinics that do offer abortions only have a window of 6 weeks, which is typically the moment in which most women find out that they're pregnant. So they have to make an immediate choice of whether to abort then or lose an opportunity to do that the further along they get in their pregnancy.
And we should also add that this environment of violence and intimidation, it's not something that was in the 90s. I mean, there's reporting of this, these tactics continue to this day. The National Abortion Federation, which tracks violence against abortion providers, said that 2019 was beyond anything that they'd ever seen before. I want to ask a question of you two that I'm not entirely sure how to phrase, but, as pure effective tactic, this is incredibly effective. And I wonder if there are lessons, I don't know if that's the right word, but I wonder if there are lessons or ways to look at the anti-abortion movement of the last couple of decades and say that potentially there are other, what we should learn about the tactics there and the strategies there and whether it can apply to other movements.
I mean, I think at least one lesson is that violent terroristic tactics like these are often in service of broader political goals. And I think it's important to look at the wider coalition that is pushing for those goals and how they relate to the violent wings of their ideology. And I keep thinking about, maybe because Rush Limbaugh just died, the rise of militias in the 1990s and the Oklahoma City bombing and the sympathetic words that Limbaugh had for militias and his own call for the need for a second American Revolution, and understanding that it's not really possible to completely cordon off political violence from broader movements, depending on how those movements relate to their more violent wings.
I don't really want to say that violence works because that that never feels very good to say, but I will say that I think these campaigns were very effective in creating an all in or nothing message in which everything was very black and white. You either are for us or against us, and there was very little gray area in a circumstance that's full of ambiguities and questions and grayness. And so I think, if anything, that's been one of the most successful things, is that there is no room for you to be somewhat supportive, right? You have to be all in or you're against them. And that's one of the ways in which they have marketed themselves and created these very little windows for a room to talk and negotiate.
Yeah, which, I mean, as you're describing that reflects the state of our politics in general, right? It's just the lack of space for nuance, and it's just all, one side or the other. Yeah, you're exactly right.
The only thing that I would add to that is, in order to support Kellie's violence is not the answer approach, is to say that there is a cost to this kind of political violence. I mean, we saw this with the Weather Underground and the sort of discrediting of the New Left. When the Oklahoma City bombing happens, there is a real crackdown on militia groups after the siege on the Capitol. Obviously, there wasn't a break with the Republican Party, but there were real consequences for that violence. And many Americans, though not all, were revolted by what they saw. And that has political consequences. So it isn't just like, oh, this is an effective tactic that will further our goals. You pay a price for it as well.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think that's where we're going to leave it. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, listener-supported, artist-owned podcasts. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. Kala Nakua helps with our transcripts. You can find a transcript for every show. There's a link at thisdaypod.com. You can also get in touch with us through our website, thisdaypod.com, with any questions or comments about the show or suggestions for future topics. My name is Jody Avirgan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.
Radiotopia from